You're lucky I'm even offering you a buyout, Adrienne, Terrence said, tossing a leather-bound folder onto the granite island. Most men would just leave you with the house and a good luck note. Just sign the quitclaim. You're 54. You're too tired for this level of commercial management anyway. Let the young people handle the stress. My husband of 28 years stood there in a suit I had custom tailored for him, looking at me like I was a piece of software that had stopped updating. My daughter Chloe sat at the table, eyes glued to her phone, her silence a sharp, jagged betrayal. She didn't look up when her father suggested I was obsolete. They had absolutely no idea. They thought I was the backbone, the sturdy, silent thing you walk all over and never expect to move. They didn't know that for the last 6 months, every single document I had signed in this house, from the renewed homeowner's insurance to the buyout papers Terrence kept shoving in my face, was executed with a very specific, pressurized disappearing ink I'd sourced through an old contact in private security. Before I show you how I let him steal a hollow empire while I moved every real asset into a blind trust he can't even spell, comment your city. Like and subscribe if you've ever been the woman who built the house only for the tenants to try and evict her. I'm Adrienne Vance. I spent 3 decades building Vance & Associates into the premier estate management firm in Atlanta. I was the silence, the strategist, and the bank. Terrence was just the face. And today, I watched his face turn a very specific shade of arrogant triumph as he tucked that signed folder into his briefcase, heading off to fund his 23-year-old mistress's new boutique with what he thought was my permission. His downfall wasn't starting. It was already dry. The kitchen smelled of French roast and the expensive lilies Terrence bought when he was lying. He didn't know I knew about Brianna. He didn't know I'd seen the Brianna Collection mood boards on his tablet, or the $150,000 marketing withdrawal from our joint reserve. He thought he was being clever, forging my signature on the initial boutique lease, then coming back today to legitimize his theft by forcing me to sign over the remaining commercial deeds. "Addie, are you even listening?" Terrence asked, his voice dripping with that practiced, patriarchal patience. "It's a clean break. You keep the Cascade Heights house, I take the downtown holdings. It's fair." "Fair," I repeated. The word felt like ash. I looked at Chloe. "And you, baby? You think your mother is too tired for the business she built before you could walk?" Chloe finally looked up, her expression a mix of pity and irritation. "Mom, Dad just wants you to relax. You've been so intense lately. Maybe a spa year in Sedona would be good for you." She had his eyes, but she had my grandmother's chin. I wondered when I had become a spa year in her mind, instead of the woman who negotiated her way through the 2008 crash to keep her private school tuition paid. "I'll sign," I said quietly. I reached into the pocket of my silk robe and pulled out my own pen, a simple black-barreled Pilot. It looked like any other pen you'd find in a kitchen junk drawer. I signed the quitclaim for the Peachtree building, the crown jewel of my portfolio. I signed the transfer for the Vanguard accounts. I signed it all with a steady hand. Terrence exhaled a sound of pure relief. He reached out to pat my hand, but I pulled it back to adjust my robe. I didn't want his touch on my skin. It felt like a stain. "You're doing the right thing, Addie," he said, snatching the papers. "I've got a 10 a.m. meeting. Chloe, you coming?" "Yeah, Dad. I need a ride to the gallery." They left together, the heavy front door clicking shut with a finality that should have broken me. I stood in the silence of my $3 million kitchen, watching the clock. In exactly 48 hours, the ink on those pages would begin to react with the oxygen in the air. By the time Terrence reached the closing at the bank on Friday morning, he wouldn't be holding deeds, he would be holding blank sheets of paper. And more importantly, he'd be holding the evidence, because the ink leaves a chemical residue that only shows up under a specific UV frequency, a residue that proves the documents were tampered with. I walked over to the sink and poured the rest of the coffee down the drain. I wasn't tired. I was just getting started. The silence in the house didn't feel like peace. It felt like a tactical pause. I stood at the kitchen island, staring at the spot where the leather folder had been. Terrence always loved leather. He loved the smell of success, the weight of a heavy desk, and the way people looked at him when he walked into a room. He never realized that the room only quieted because I had already paved the way with 36 phone calls and a decade of meticulous reputation building. I went to the pantry and opened the small disguised safe behind the spice rack. Inside wasn't jewelry or cash. It was a digital ledger, a silver encrypted drive that held the true history of Vance and Associates. My husband thought he was a genius because he'd successfully forged my name on a boutique lease in Buckhead for a girl named Brianna Miller. He thought I hadn't noticed the $12,000 monthly wire transfers labeled consultancy fees. But when you've spent 20 years watching the flow of other people's money, you develop an ear for the rhythm of a lie. Terrence's lies sounded like a drum slightly out of time. I sat at the small breakfast nook, the morning sun hitting the polished wood. My mind went back to 2 months ago, at the Piedmont Hospital Gala. I had seen her then. Brianna. She was wearing a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, standing a little too close to my husband. Terrence had introduced her as a rising star in retail development. I had watched the way his thumb grazed her lower back for a fraction of a second. It wasn't the touch of a mentor. It was the touch of an owner. "Mom, you still here?" I blinked. Chloe had come back inside looking for her car keys. She looked at me with that same distant, clinical pity. "I thought you'd be upstairs lying down by now," she said, snatching her keys from the counter. "Dad said you've been having those episodes, the forgetfulness." I felt a cold chill settle in my marrow. Episodes, forgetfulness. So that was the play. Terrence wasn't just leaving. He was building a case for my incompetence. He was telling our daughter that I was losing my mind so she wouldn't question why he was stripping the company away from me. He was making her an accomplice under the guise of protection. "I'm fine, Chloe," I said, my voice as level as a horizon. "I was just thinking about your grandmother. She always said, 'Adrienne, never trust a man who smiles more than he sweats.'" Chloe rolled her eyes. "Grandma lived in a shack in Alabama, Mom. Times have changed. Dad is trying to save the legacy. You should let him." "The legacy," I whispered as she disappeared back out the door. She didn't know that the legacy was currently being hollowed out like a termite-ridden tree. Terrence hadn't just used the money for the boutique. He'd used the commercial properties as collateral for a high-risk private equity loan to fund a lifestyle Brianna demanded. He was gambling with the very roof over our heads. I opened my laptop and logged into a portal he didn't know existed. It was a secondary server I'd set up years ago as a backup for our estate clients. I watched the cursor blink. He thought Friday's closing would be his coronation. He thought he'd present the quitclaims, the bank would release the final $2 million in liquidity, and he and Brianna would be the new power couple of the Atlanta Strip. I hit a sequence of keys, authorizing the transfer of the Vance Family Trust into a newly formed entity, the Solace Group. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a repossession. I didn't feel the rush of revenge I expected. I only felt the weight of the last 28 years. The dinners kept warm for a man who never came home. The soccer games I attended alone while Terrence networked, and the subtle, bone-deep exhaustion of being the foundation for people who only ever looked down at their feet. I stood up and smoothed my robe. I had an appointment at 1 p.m. with a woman named Adrienne Vance. No relation, just a sharp-eyed attorney I'd kept on retainer for 6 months. I looked at the family photo on the wall. Terrence, Chloe, and me. We looked perfect. We looked like the dream. I reached up and turned the frame face down. I drove into Midtown with the windows up and Anita Baker's voice filling the cabin of my SUV. It was one of those thick Atlanta afternoons where the heat feels like a physical weight, pressing the scent of asphalt and blooming jasmine into the upholstery. Most people in my position would be screaming, or at least weeping. I just hummed along to Caught Up in the Rapture, my hands steady on the leather-wrapped wheel. Evelyn's office was in one of those glass and steel towers that looked like a jagged tooth against the skyline. She was a woman who didn't believe in soft edges, not in her decor, and certainly not in her litigation style. "He's escalating," Evelyn said, sliding a manila folder across her desk. She didn't offer me tea or sympathy. We had moved past that months ago. "The disappearing ink was a brilliant stopgap, Adrienne, but we have a new problem. He didn't just forge your signature on the Buckhead lease." I felt a slight hitch in my breathing. "What else?" "The educational trust," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "The one you set up for Chloe when she was 6. He's filed a motion to restructure it, citing your supposed mental decline as a reason to move the management of the funds to himself. He used a forged medical affidavit from a doctor I've never heard of." The humming in my head stopped. It was one thing to steal from me. We had built that life together, and if he wanted to burn his half of the field, that was his choice. But Chloe? To use his own daughter's future as a piggy bank for a mistress's vanity project while telling the girl her mother was losing her mind? That wasn't just betrayal. That was a dismantling of a soul. "He thinks he's being surgical," I said, my voice sounding distant even to me. "He thinks he can remove me and keep the life I provided. He's already spent nearly 80,000 of Chloe's liquid assets," Evelyn continued, her eyes sharp behind her designer frames. "The boutique, the Brianna collection, is hemorrhaging cash before the doors even open. He's trying to bridge the gap before the Friday closing. He needs that $2 million from the commercial buyout to replace what he's taken from Chloe before she notices." "She already doesn't notice," I whispered, thinking of the way Chloe had looked at me this morning. "He's groomed her to see me as the obstacle, the intense mother who won't let her live her life." "Then let him have the signatures he got this morning," Evelyn said, a cold smile touching her lips. "By Friday morning, when he walks into that bank to finalize the loan that replaces Chloe's trust money, those documents will be blank. The bank will see a man trying to secure a multi-million-dollar loan with empty paper. They'll flag it as fraud immediately. It triggers a mandatory audit of every account associated with his name." I leaned back, the cool air of the office finally reaching my skin. "And because I've already moved the Vance family trust into the Solace Group, the audit won't find my money. It will only find his debts." "And the forgeries," Evelyn added, "especially the ones where he used your name to guarantee Brianna's personal credit lines. When those bank officers see blank pages where a signature should be, they're going to look at the previous filings. They'll see the inconsistencies. He's built a house of cards on a windy day, Adrienne." I looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere down there, Terrence was probably buying a bottle of Cristal to celebrate his victory. He was probably telling Brianna that the old woman was finally handled. "I need to see the doctor," I said. "The one who signed the affidavit?" Evelyn asked. "No," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "I need to see the man who thinks my mind is failing. I want to see exactly how far he's willing to go when he thinks I've forgotten who I am." I left the office and walked to the elevator. As the door slid shut, I caught my reflection in the polished chrome. I didn't look like a woman losing her mind. I looked like a woman who had finally found her center. But as I reached my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. "Mom, Dad said he forgot to pay the gardener again. I handled it from my savings. Please just take your meds. Love you." I stared at the screen until the light dimmed. I hadn't forgotten the gardener. The gardener had been paid 6 months in advance. Terrence was intercepting the mail. He wasn't just lying to her. He was creating a reality where I didn't exist. The table was set with the fine bone china I'd bought in Savannah for our 15th anniversary. Terrence had insisted on a family dinner to celebrate what he called the new chapter of our lives. He'd picked up a catered spread from a high-end Creole spot, shrimp Creole, blackened snapper, and cornbread that smelled of honey and deceit. "You look lovely tonight, Addie," Terrence said, pouring a glass of buttery Chardonnay. He reached across the table to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was clinical, the way a man might check a piece of fruit for bruises. "Doesn't she look rested, Chloe?" Chloe nodded, her eyes soft with that unbearable pity. "You do, Mom. I'm glad you're finally taking it easy." I watched them. The two people I had spent my life shielding from the sharp edges of the world were now sitting across from me, speaking about me as if I were a ghost already halfway out the door. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice intentionally trailing off. I let my gaze wander to the corner of the room, holding it there for a beat too long. Did I send out the invitations for the garden club luncheon? I can't seem to find the stamps." Terrence's eyes flickered with a dark, predatory satisfaction. "You did, honey, last week. Don't you remember? You were so worried about the calligraphy." "I hadn't. There was no luncheon. I'd invented the event as a test. Terrence didn't just want me to be forgetful. He was actively filling the gaps in my memory with his own architecture. He was building a prison out of things that never happened." "Oh, right," I whispered, looking down at my plate. "I must have... It's just so much to keep track of." "That's why the buyout is for the best," Terrence said, leaning in. "Friday morning, once the bank confirms the transfer of the commercial titles, you won't have to track anything anymore. I've even looked into a few wellness retreats in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Fresh air, no screens, professional staff to handle the details." Professional staff. He wasn't talking about a spa. He was talking about a facility. He wanted me tucked away, sedated by mountain air and wellness, while he and Brianna played house with my assets. "That sounds... quiet," I said. I stood up, claiming I needed more water. I walked into the kitchen, my heels silent on the Persian rug. I didn't go for the water, I went for the mail slot in the mudroom. I'd noticed the brass flap was slightly misaligned earlier. I reached my hand deep into the side of the built-in cabinet where the mail dropped. My fingers brushed something thin and crisp. I pulled it out. It was a stack of envelopes, tucked into the narrow gap between the cabinet wall and the drawer. The gardener's invoice marked paid. A letter from my sister in Birmingham, and a certified notice from the county tax assessor regarding the Buckhead Boutique's property taxes, addressed to Adrienne Vance, guarantor. The forgery was deeper than I'd realized. He hadn't just signed my name to the lease, he had made me the primary guarantor for the boutique's tax liabilities. If the business failed, and looking at the Brianna collection numbers, it was designed to fail, the city would come for me, not him. I tucked the envelopes into the waistband of my skirt, under my sweater. "Mom, you okay in there?" Chloe called out. I took a deep breath, grabbed the crystal pitcher, and walked back into the dining room. I forced a small, fragile smile. "I'm fine, baby," I said, pouring the water. "I just forgot where we kept the ice for a second." Terrence chuckled, a warm, paternal sound that made my skin crawl. "See? This is what I'm talking about. Just a few more days, Addie, then you can let it all go." I looked him straight in the eye. For the first time in months, I let him see the clarity in mine. He didn't recognize it. He was too blinded by the reflection of his own reflection. "You're right, Terrence," I said. "On Friday, I'm going to let go of everything that doesn't belong to me." He raised his glass in a toast. He thought we were talking about the same thing. The house was still at 3 a.m., the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's holding its breath. I sat in my home office, the only light coming from a small desk lamp. On the blotter lay a test sheet, a scrap of the same vellum Terrence had used for the quitclaims. I'd signed it at the same time I'd signed his buyout papers. I watched it now under the glow of the lamp. The blue-black ink was already beginning to ghost. The edges of the letters were fraying, turning into a faint, yellowish vapor that smelled vaguely of wintergreen. By dawn, the page would be as white as the day it was milled. Terrence thought he had secured my consent. In reality, he had secured a vacuum. I opened my laptop to check the Solace Group accounts one last time. Everything was in position. The liquid assets from our joint holdings had been diverted into the trust over the last 48 hours, triggered by the mental incompetence affidavit Terrence had filed. He'd opened a door to lock me in, not realizing I'd already moved the furniture out through the back. But there was still the matter of Dr. Eris Thorne. The name on the affidavit was unfamiliar to me, which was rare. I knew every reputable geriatric and neurological specialist in the greater Atlanta area. I spent the next hour digging into the medical registry. Thorne wasn't a specialist. He was a general practitioner whose license had been suspended in Florida 5 years ago for overprescribing stimulants. He'd resurfaced in a strip mall clinic in East Point, the kind of place where the waiting room chairs are bolted to the floor. Terrence hadn't found a doctor. He'd bought a signature. The next morning, I didn't wait for the wellness talk. I dressed in a charcoal power suit, the fabric crisp and unforgiving. I did my hair in a low, tight bun. I looked like the woman who had built an empire, not the ghost Terrence was trying to summon. I drove to East Point. The clinic sat between a payday loan shop and a shuttered nail salon. The air inside smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial lemon cleaner. "I'm here to see Dr. Thorne," I told the receptionist, a woman whose name tag read V. She didn't look up from her computer. "You got an appointment?" "No," I said, leaning over the counter. I didn't raise my voice. I used the matriarch's tone, the one that makes people realize the air in the room just got more expensive. "But I have a copy of a fraudulent medical affidavit with his name on it, and a direct line to the state medical board. I imagine he'll want to see me before I press send." V looked up then. She saw the suit. She saw the eyes. She picked up the intercom. 2 minutes later, I was in Thorne's office. He was a man who looked like he'd slept in his clothes for 3 days straight. His hands shook as he adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Vance," he stammered, there must be a misunderstanding. Your husband provided the clinical observations. My husband provided a check," I interrupted, sitting down without being asked. I placed my phone on his desk, the screen displaying a draft email to the board. "I'm not here to ruin you, doctor. You've already done that to yourself. I'm here for the counter affidavit." "The what?" "A full recantation," I said, "stating that Terrence Vance pressured you to sign a pre-written statement and that you have never examined me. You'll also include a clean bill of mental health based on our consultation today." "I can't do that. He'll sue me." "He'll be too busy dealing with the FBI to worry about a disgraced GP in East Point," I said. "You have 10 minutes to print it, or I can find out if the medical board still has your Florida file on hand." He didn't argue. The sound of the printer was the only noise in the room. As he signed the new document, with real permanent ink, I felt a strange sense of mourning. Not for Terrence, but for the life I'd spent being the backbone. The backbone is the part of the body that takes the most strain and gets the least attention until it snaps. I wasn't snapping. I was realigning. I tucked the recantation into my bag. Friday was 24 hours away. As I walked back to my car, my phone rang. It was the bank. "Mrs. Vance, this is Marcus at First National. We just received the digital scan of the quitclaim deeds from your husband's office for the Friday closing. We're noticing some technical issues with the file. The signatures aren't appearing on our high-resolution scanners." I smiled at the steering wheel. "That is strange, Marcus. Maybe it's just the light." I returned home to find Terrence in his study, The door cracked just enough for his frantic energy to spill into the hallway. The house was bathed in the amber glow of the sunset, long shadows stretching across the hardwood like fingers reaching for things they couldn't hold. "I don't care about the DPI settings, Marcus," Terrence hissed into his phone. "The signatures were there when I scanned them. It's probably a software glitch on your end. I'll bring the physical originals to the closing tomorrow morning. Just have the wire ready for the boutique's final lease payment. It has to clear by noon." He slammed the phone down and let out a jagged breath. I stood in the doorway, my expression curated into a mask of mild, vacant confusion. "Is everything all right, Terrence? You look flushed," I said, my voice soft. He jumped, clutching the edge of his mahogany desk. For a split second, I saw it. The flicker of genuine fear. Not of me, but of the possibility that his carefully constructed house of lies had a termite problem. Then, the mask of the doting, concerned husband snapped back into place. "Just work, Addie. The bank is being incompetent. Go on, get some rest. You have that big wellness trip tomorrow, remember? Chloe and I are going to drive you." "I remember," I lied. I looked past him to the leather folder on his desk. He'd opened it to check the pages. To his naked eye, the signatures were still there. Faint, perhaps, but present. He didn't know that the chemical reaction accelerated under the heat of a scanner's lamp. Every time he tried to digitize his proof, he was essentially bleaching his own future. I walked into the kitchen where Chloe was staring into the refrigerator, her shoulders hunched. She looked younger than 24 in the dim light, reminded me of the girl who used to hide behind my legs when strangers spoke to her. "I made some tea, baby," I said, setting a mug of chamomile on the counter. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on you." Chloe turned, her eyes red-rimmed. "Mom, why does everything feel so weird? Dad is always shouting on the phone, and you're just here, but not really here. It feels like the house is shrinking." I wanted to pull her to my chest. I wanted to tell her that the house wasn't shrinking. It was being purged. But if I told her now, she'd run to him. She'd try to save the family by warning the very man who was pickpocketing her future. "Changes are always uncomfortable, Chloe," I said, my hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. "But sometimes you have to let the old structure fall so you can see the view." "Dad says you're sick," she whispered, a single tear tracking through her highlighter. "He says you're going to a place where they can help you remember things." "And do you believe him?" I asked. I didn't press. I didn't plead. I just watched her. She looked at the tea, then back at me. For the first time in months, the pity was gone, replaced by a flickering, terrifying doubt. "I don't know what to believe. You don't seem sick. You seem cold." "Distance can look like coldness when you're used to the heat of a fire," I said. "Go to bed, Chloe. Tomorrow is a long day." I left her there and went to my bedroom, the room I'd shared with Terrence for nearly 3 decades. I didn't lie in the bed. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. I thought about Brianna Miller, probably at home, dreaming of her name in gold leaf over a boutique door. I thought about the forged signatures on the tax guarantees. I reached into my bag and felt the crisp edges of the doctor's recantation. Tonight, Terrence would sleep the sleep of a victor. Tomorrow, he would wake up to a world where his ink had turned to air, and his wife had turned into a reckoning. The morning of the closing arrived with a thin gray drizzle that blurred the edges of the manicured lawns in Cascade Heights. I dressed with the deliberate slowness of a woman who had nowhere to be, though my heart was beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. I chose a simple navy sheath dress and the pearls Terrence had given me for our 20th, a peace offering after he'd been caught in a late-night strategy session that smelled of Chanel No. 5. "Are you ready, Addie?" Terrence called from the foyer. His voice was bright, vibrating with the manic energy of a man about to touch a finish line he hadn't earned. I walked down the stairs, carrying a small silver suitcase. It didn't hold clothes for a wellness retreat. It held the original formation documents of Vance and Associates, the deeds to the 3 properties he didn't know I owned outright, and the counter affidavit from Dr. Thorne. Chloe stood by the door, her face pale. She wouldn't look at me. She was holding her car keys like a rosary. "I'm ready," I said. My voice was a whisper, thin and fragile. I played the part of the ghost perfectly. The drive to First National was silent. Terrence sat in the driver's seat of his Mercedes, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the steering wheel. Every few miles, he'd reach over and pat the leather folder on the center console. He was checking for its pulse. He didn't know he was escorting a corpse. "After the bank, we'll head straight to the Blue Ridge," Terrence said, his eyes fixed on the road. "Chloe, you can follow us in your car. We'll have a nice lunch at the lodge before we get your mom settled." "Okay, Dad," Chloe muttered. She caught my eye in the rearview mirror, and for a second, the mask of pity slipped. She looked confused. She looked like she was finally seeing the disconnect between the woman her father described and the woman sitting in the back seat. We pulled into the bank's private parking lot at 9:55 a.m. Marcus, the senior vice president, was waiting for us in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the lobby. He was a man of iron shirts and spreadsheets, someone who believed that numbers didn't lie. "Terrence, Adrienne, Chloe," Marcus said, standing to greet us. He looked stressed. His gaze kept flickering to the tablet on the table. "I'm glad you're here. We've been having a hell of a time with those digital scans. The system keeps flagging them as incomplete." "Software glitches, Marcus," Terrence said, pulling the chair out for me with a flourish of mock chivalry. He sat down and slapped the leather folder onto the table. "I told you, I have the physical originals right here, signed and witnessed." I sat perfectly still. I watched the dust motes dancing in the sterile office light. "Good," Marcus said, pulling a set of loan disbursement forms toward him. "Because the boutique lease in Buckhead is set to default at noon if the bridge loan isn't finalized. And without these commercial properties as collateral, I can't authorize the wire." Terrence smiled. The same smile he'd used when he proposed, the one that used to make me feel safe. He flipped open the leather folder. "Here you go," he said, sliding the first quitclaim toward Marcus. "The Peachtree Building, signed by Adrienne herself." Marcus adjusted his glasses. He leaned forward, then he frowned. He picked up the paper and held it toward the light of the window. "Terrence," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a flat, dangerous register. "Is this some kind of joke?" "What are you talking about?" Terrence leaned in, his brows furrowing. "There's nothing here," Marcus said. He turned the paper around. The page was a pristine, terrifying white. The lines where my signature had been were gone. The witness lines were gone. It looked like a fresh sheet of stationery, mocking and empty. Terrence snatched the paper. He flipped through the rest of the folder. Blank, blank, blank. His hands began to shake, not a small tremor, but a violent, systemic quaking. I don't... They were here! I watched her sign them!" He turned to me, his face turning a ghostly, sickly pale. "Adrienne, what did you do?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him with the vacant, tilted-head curiosity of someone trying to remember a dream. The silence in the conference room was so absolute, I could hear the hum of the air conditioner and the frantic, shallow rhythm of Terrence's breathing. He was staring at the blank sheets of paper as if he could manifest the ink back into existence through sheer desperation. "It was a trick pen," Terrence whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up, his eyes wild, darting between Marcus and me. "She used a trick pen. She's not sick, Marcus. She's sabotaging me. She's trying to bankrupt the company." Marcus didn't move. He looked at the blank pages, then at Terrence's shaking hands, and finally at me. As a banker, Marcus dealt in cold, hard proof. What he saw was a man presenting empty documents for a multi-million-dollar loan and then blaming his mentally declining wife for the failure of physics. "Terrence," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a professional chill. "Are you telling me you brought me into a closing with documents you didn't verify? This isn't a software glitch. This is a void, and frankly, it looks like an attempt to bypass legal oversight." "I verified them!" Terrence screamed, slamming his fist on the table. Chloe jumped, her chair screeching against the floor. "I watched her sign! Adrienne, tell him! Tell him you signed the Peachtree deed!" I looked at Terrence. I didn't let the ghost mask slip yet. I just let my lip tremble, a tiny, practiced motion. I turned to Chloe. "I signed what you told me to sign, Terrence," I said softly. "But my hands, they were so tired. Maybe I didn't press hard enough? Is that why the words went away?" "Mom," Chloe breathed. She moved her chair closer to mine, her eyes fixed on her father. She was seeing the man I'd seen for years, the one who screamed when he couldn't control the narrative. "Dad, stop it. You're scaring her." "She's lying, Chloe. She's playing you." Terrence lunged for the folder, but Marcus pulled it away. "Enough," Marcus said. "There will be no bridge loan today. In fact, I'm freezing the Vance & Associates operating accounts pending a full internal review. We have a protocol for irregular documentation, especially when it involves property transfers from a spouse with a contested mental status." Terrence went gray. "You can't freeze the accounts. The Buckhead lease, the boutique. The payment is due in 90 minutes. "The boutique," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. I reached into my silver suitcase and pulled out the certified notice from the tax assessor I'd found in the mudroom. "Is that why the city sent this, Terrence? Because my name is listed as the guarantor for a business I've never stepped foot in?" I slid the paper across the table to Marcus. Terrence froze. He looked at the tax notice, then at me, then at the suitcase. He realized then that the suitcase didn't hold wellness clothes. "Marcus," I said, my voice now clear, resonant, and entirely sane. "My husband has spent the last 6 months convincing our daughter and our community that I am losing my mind. He even secured a fraudulent affidavit from a disgraced doctor to justify taking control of my assets he intended to use to fund a mistress's lifestyle." I pulled out the counter-affidavit from Dr. Thorne. "This is a recantation from that same doctor," I continued, admitting that Terrence Vance pressured him into signing a false statement. "And this," I pulled out a second folder, "is a forensic accounting of the $150,000 he moved from our joint reserve into a shell company called the Brianna Collection." The room felt like it had run out of oxygen. Chloe made a small, strangled sound in the back of her throat. She snatched the tax notice, her eyes scanning the signature at the bottom, the one Terrence had forged in my name months ago. "This isn't Mom's handwriting," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with a different kind of pain. "Dad, you used her name? To pay for her?" Terrence didn't look at Chloe. He was looking at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The doting husband was dead. "You think you're so smart," he hissed, leaning over the table. "You think you can just walk away with everything? I built that name. I am Vance & Associates." "No, Terrence," I said, standing up. I felt taller than I had in 20 years. "You were the face. I was the foundation. And you've spent the last year trying to crack the very thing holding you up." I turned to Marcus. "I've already moved my personal holdings and the family trust into a private entity. If you want to discuss the commercial deeds, you'll have to speak to my attorney, Evelyn Vance. She's waiting for my call." I picked up my suitcase. I didn't look back at the blank papers. I didn't need them. The truth had finally left its mark. I walked out of the conference room, the click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a gavel. I didn't run. I didn't rush. A woman who knows where she's going never has to hurry. Adrienne, wait! Terrence's voice echoed through the high-ceilinged lobby, stripped of its usual baritone authority. It was thin, reedy, the sound of a man who had finally realized the ground beneath him was nothing but air. He caught up to me near the heavy glass revolving doors, his face a frantic mosaic of sweat and desperation. "You can't do this," he panted, reaching for my arm. I stopped and looked at his hand until he pulled it back, his fingers twitching. "The noon deadline, Addie. If that wire doesn't go through, the landlord in Buckhead seizes the inventory. Brianna, she's already at the store for the soft opening. Everything I put into this—" "Everything you stole to put into this," I corrected him. I stood under the grand chandelier, the light catching the silver in my hair. "You didn't build a boutique, Terrence. You built a monument to your own ego using my bricks. And you did it while trying to convince our daughter that I was a broken vessel." Chloe emerged from the hallway behind him. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face had gone stone cold, a mirror of the expression I'd worn for 28 years. She walked past her father as if he were a piece of discarded furniture and stood beside me. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Don't talk to her. Don't even look at her." "Chloe, baby, you don't understand the business side of this. I understand that you used my college fund as a security deposit for your mistress's dressing rooms," Chloe snapped. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his mouth hanging open. "I saw the ledger, Dad. Mom didn't have to tell me. I saw your signature next to the withdrawals." I looked at the clock on the bank wall. 11:45 a.m. "The Solace Group has already replenished Chloe's trust," I said quietly. "And as for your boutique, I took the liberty of calling the landlord this morning. The real one, not the shell company you've been dealing with. It turns out he's an old client of mine from the early days. When he heard the guarantor signature was a forgery, he was more than happy to terminate the lease effective immediately." Terrence's eyes went wide. You killed it? Before it even started?" "I didn't kill it. I simply withdrew the life support you stole from me," I said. "Go to Brianna, Terrence. Tell her the Brianna collection is being boxed up and moved to a storage unit in East Point. I'm sure Dr. Thorne can recommend a good mover." The transition of power was absolute. I could see it in the way the bank security guards watched us, their postures shifting from deference to Terrence to a watchful, protective stance around me. They knew who the account holder was now. I turned to the door. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of stubborn Georgia sun was breaking through the clouds, reflecting off the wet pavement like a sea of diamonds. "Mom?" Chloe asked, her hand finally finding mine. Her grip was tight, desperate. "Where are we going?" I squeezed her hand, not the grip of a woman who needed a backbone, but the grip of a woman who was one. "We're going to get your things from the house, Chloe," I said, "and then, I think I'd like to see that gallery you've been working at. The one your father said was a waste of time." We walked out together, leaving Terrence standing in the center of the lobby. He looked small. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life trying to be a king, only to find out he'd been living in a house of cards I'd let him borrow. As I reached the car, I looked back one last time. Through the glass, I saw Marcus handing Terrence a set of business cards for a high-interest debt counselor. The ghost signatures were gone, and for the first time in 3 decades, so was the wait. The house in Cascade Heights was quiet when we returned, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the morning. It was the stillness of a theater after the final curtain has dropped. I walked through the foyer, my eyes grazing the portraits, the expensive molding, and the imported rugs. For years, I had viewed these things as the rewards of my labor. Now they just looked like chores I no longer wanted to do. "Are you okay, Mom?" Chloe asked, standing at the base of the stairs. She was holding her keys so tight her knuckles were white. "I'm more than okay, baby," I said. I went to the kitchen and pulled a cardboard box from the pantry. "I'm finished. There's a difference." I didn't pack much. I didn't want the matriarch wardrobe or the jewelry Terrence had bought to distract me from his late nights. I packed my grandmother's cast iron skillet, my personal journals, and the silver encrypted drive. Everything else was just property, and property could be sold. By 4 p.m., Terrence's sister Valine was calling, then my brother-in-law, then the pastor from the church where Terrence served on the board. The news of the bank incident was traveling through the community like a brush fire. They weren't calling to check on me. They were calling because the backbone had moved, and the whole structure was starting to lean. "Adrienne, honey," Valine's voice crackled through the Bluetooth speaker as I folded a sweater. "Terrence is at my house in a state. He says you've had some kind of breakdown. He says you're trying to ruin him. We need to sit down as a family and pray through this. Think about the legacy, Addie." I stopped folding. I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange, detached clarity. "The legacy was a lie, Valine," I said, "and the prayer happened at 5 this morning. It was answered at 10. Tell Terrence the locksmith is coming at 6 and his things will be in the garage. He has 48 hours before I call the estate sale company." I hung up. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I had spent 20 years explaining things to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Chloe came down with 2 suitcases. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for the woman she used to know, the one who would have stayed and fixed it. She didn't find her. She found someone else. "Where are we staying tonight?" she asked. "I bought a small place in Savannah a few years ago," I said. "Under a different name. It's near the water. It's quiet. You can stay as long as you need, or you can go back to your apartment, but I'm going to the coast." She nodded, a slow, maturing realization dawning on her face. "I think I'd like to see the water, Mom." We walked out to the SUV. I didn't look back at the house as we pulled out of the driveway. I didn't think about the Brianna collection or the empty commercial deeds. I thought about the garden I was going to plant in Savannah. I thought about the books I was going to read without interruption. We stopped at a light near the park. I watched an older woman sitting on a bench feeding the birds. She looked peaceful. She looked seen by no one, and yet entirely herself. My phone buzzed in the console. A final text from Terrence. "You're going to die alone, Adrienne. Nobody wants a woman who's this cold." I didn't delete it. I didn't reply. I just turned the phone off and tucked it into the glove box. "You okay?" Chloe asked, glancing at me. "I am," I said. I reached out and turned on the radio. A jazz station was playing something low and brassy, a trumpet solo that felt like a long, slow exhale. I settled into the seat, the road stretching out ahead of us, gray and silver under the evening sky. I wasn't the backbone anymore. I was the person standing upright, finally carrying nothing but my own weight. It was lighter than I ever imagined. I kept my eyes on the road and drove.